questions about the Catholic faith. Now, you can't call today, and you can't even text today because we are doing a special mailbag program wherein we answer a bunch of questions that have been emailed to us over the past couple of weeks. If you'd like to send us an email, you can do that today by sending it to ctc@ewtn.com. ctc@ewtn.com. But for today, we're just going to tackle a whole bunch of these emailed questions, and that would include Michael Birchfield, our producer, me, Tom Price, and Dr. David Anders, the guy actually doing the answering.
Tom, how are you today?
Doing very well. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well.
I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you. I'm grateful.
Grateful is a good word. We're going to get to some of these longer emails as well today, the ones that we've had to set aside because they're just a little bit too long, quite honestly, for the live shows. But we've got some very good ones here. This one is from Jane, who says, "We attended a Sunday Mass recently with friends at a Lutheran church. The priest who celebrated that Mass was an ordained Catholic priest who had voluntarily resigned from his position with the Catholic Church some years ago. Later, he obtained his position with the Lutheran Church. He is now also married. The Mass was the same as a Mass in the Catholic Church, at least it seems so to Jane. We received communion at this Mass." So 2 questions. Number 1, was the consecrated host we received the body and blood of Jesus? And 2, as practicing Catholics, was it wrong to attend church with our friends? Thanks, Jane.
Okay, thanks, Jane. Several things going on here. First of all, you did not go to a Mass at a Lutheran church. That is one thing you did not do. You went to a Lutheran liturgy, but it was not a Mass. Martin Luther himself, the founder of Lutheranism, was extremely clear. He could not have been more clear that he regarded the Catholic Mass as the worst form of blasphemy and the thing he hated most about the Catholic tradition. He was, as you know about Luther through his teachings about Scripture alone or justification by faith alone, but he was just as animated in rejecting the Catholic Mass. Did not like the Catholic Mass, wanted nothing to do with the Catholic Mass. So you certainly did not attend a Mass. You attended a liturgy, but not a Mass. What's the difference? The Catholic Mass is that form of liturgy that is very intentionally sacrificial. It is the offering of the body and blood of Christ to God in reparation for the sins of the world. The Mass is a sacrifice. Luther rejected the idea that the Eucharist was a sacrificial offering, and on that basis rejected the sacrifice of the Mass.
Okay.
Now, for that reason also, Lutherans don't have priests. They don't have priests. They don't have the priest as a specific office within the church. They believe that everyone is a priest insofar as they share in the priesthood of Christ, but they deny that there is a distinct ministerial priesthood within the church. So they don't hold that either. They would call them ministers or pastors or something like that. If a Catholic priest, validly ordained Catholic priest, leaves the Catholic Church, he does not cease to be a priest any more than a baptized person ceases to be baptized just because they lose the faith. They're a baptized person without faith. This is a priest who no longer holds the Catholic faith, but he still remains a priest. That means that he remains capable of validly confecting the Eucharist, provided he holds to the proper form and intends to do what the Church means by the celebration of the Eucharist. I am not going to venture a judgment about whether or not he validly confected the presence of Christ in his Lutheran liturgy. I would have to actually go look at the words of that liturgy and try to think hard about what the priest was intending to accomplish when he repeated those words. I'm not going to get down in the weeds into that. In principle, he could, but that doesn't mean that he did confect the presence of Christ in this Eucharist. But the very fact that you would raise a question about it and that I would raise a question about it goes to your third point. Was it okay for you to receive communion during that liturgy? The answer to that question is no, it was not okay for several reasons. The Eucharist, in addition to being a sacrifice, is also the sacrament of our unity as the body of Christ. And St. Paul says we are all one loaf because we partake of the one bread who is Christ. And when you partake of a Eucharistic liturgy, it is a signal that you recognize the church that Christ founded as being present in this assembly. And when you treat reception of Holy Communion as something indifferent between ecclesial organizations, it doesn't matter if I receive it in a Catholic church or a Lutheran church or wherever. It is as if you were saying Christ's church is to be found equally across these different groups. But that is not true. Christ's church is not to be found equally across these different groups. The church is present in its fullness only in the Catholic Church, constituted by the order of bishops, the profession of faith, and our unity in sacramental practice and discipline down through the centuries in direct continuity to the church founded by Jesus. That's present in its fullness only in the Catholic Church. And so your act of going to communion is a form of performative witness to your faith in the divine authority of the church founded by Jesus. If you go to communion in some other ecclesial body, it's like saluting the flag of a foreign power. Now, I'm not saying those people aren't Christians, but they are not Christians with the fullness of the faith. They're not Christians in communion with the church founded by Christ. They're defective in their Christian profession, and they're defective in their unity in Christ's body. And so we can't go to receive their putative sacraments. Finally, in this particular instance, it's a little bit fuzzy because their minister was a former Catholic priest. But in general terms, Lutherans do not have valid apostolic orders. They don't have valid bishops. And so they would not have valid Eucharists in general. And so we certainly don't want to go pay reverence to or venerate or worship the Holy Eucharist in a communion where Christ might not be sacramentally present. Then we'd be performing an act of idolatry. So a lot of reasons why you don't want to go to communion in any place but a Catholic church.
Jane, we do appreciate your email. Thank you so much for it. In a moment here, we'll be tackling more great emails that we've received over the past couple of weeks on this special mailbag edition of Call to Communion. Get to one from Joe, Beth, here's one from Anonymous, and one from Lita. Lots coming up. Keep it right here on EWTN's Call to Communion. We're probably not going to pause very much. We'll just keep rolling.
No problem.
Hey, thanks for joining us. It's a special mailbag edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Here's one of those longer ones that we were talking about before the break. This is from Lita. She says, I understand that the SSPX, which is the Society of St. Pius X, are not schismatic, but rather have an irregular status. Also, the new Mass, in many cases, as it is read, is more illicit than an SSPX Mass. Many times I have seen illicit matter used for the Eucharist. That is a good idea to look for Eastern Rite Catholics and religious order Masses. As far as the current corruption in the Church goes, we need not only to seek holiness, but also need to protect vulnerable children and young men from predators, especially in the seminaries. We cannot and will not tolerate homosexual priests and bishops. How could anyone recommend the priesthood to any young man? Also, we have a heretical pope, in my opinion, not just a hedonistic one.
Hang on a second there. Is there a question coming here, or is this just a diatribe against the church?
Well, I think Lita is saying, what's keeping you from becoming a Catholic? I think that's where she's going with it.
But you led with her, was this a defense of the Society of St. Pius X? That's how it started out, right?
Well, yeah. She says, I understand that the SSPX is not schismatic, but rather have an irregular status. Why don't we tackle that first?
Okay, so this sounds like she's bidding for participation in SSPX chapels over against the Catholic Church.
I think so.
Because there are all these problems that she perceives in Catholicism.
Yeah.
All right, let me go after that. Okay. Is the Catholic Church a mess? You bet. Absolutely. Okay. Is that a new problem? Not a new problem.
No.
Jesus founded the church, right? Absolutely. Was the church, as it was constituted by Christ, free of atrocious problems? No.
No.
Precisely 1/12 of the hierarchy in Jesus' day was horrifically corrupt. pilfering the coffers of the church for his own personal pleasure and aggrandizement,
Mm-hmm.
an apostate, a coward, a turncoat, and heaven knows what else Judas was up to. Precisely 1/12 met that description. I wouldn't venture a guess as to what the ratio is in the current hierarchy, but 1/12 is pretty high percentage.
Pretty high.
Okay. The Pope that Jesus picked, coward, denier of Christ, bows to political pressure to not fellowship with the Gentiles in Antioch, causes scandal. Not a great character. Not a great character, the Pope founded by Jesus. Let's see, two of the apostles were, so we have apostate guy, we have corrupt thief, we have coward, bows to political pressure. Then we have like the two guys on the hard right? We have the two SSPXers, if you will, that Christ called sons of thunder. Because when they saw people doing stuff, they were like, Jesus, can we go lop their heads off? Can we give them what for? Can we call down thunder and lightning and blast those guys into smithereens? Jesus says no. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we're up to 4 out of 12, right?
1/3.
So we're now a third that we know beyond shadow of a doubt we're
not walking the walk.
not walking the walk. All right. And then we got Thomas. Let's throw Thomas into the lot, right? So he just doesn't believe. He lacks faith. All right. So now we're up to 5 out of 12.
Almost half and half.
Okay. And these other guys, like, we didn't even know much about them, right? Because they some of them vanish into the weeds pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows what they were up to? That's the church founded by Jesus. That's the one founded by Jesus. I think personally, when I talk about the church and the papacy and the Constitution, that it's best to lead with our worst possible examples. That's my personal opinion. There's an argument for the divine authority of the church, De Sanctitate. You look at the holiness of the church, of the saints, and go, see this great stuff that the church has produced. There's also an argument, De Corruptione, from the church corruption, that, you know what, even with these kind of nincompoops at the helm, the church still is effective in bringing people to sanctity in every era.
Yep.
And I like to also look to St. Francis of Assisi as a model for how to engage the kind of questions that you have raised. Francis lived at a time of deep corruption in the church, sexual immorality among the clergy, self-aggrandizing, politically maneuvering popes, and all the rest of it. And did Francis throw up his hands and marry his donkey and ride off into the sunset? No. Francis followed Christ. He followed Christ. He renewed the church within his own person.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went out and started doing the work of a missionary. He didn't set up, the Society of St. Francis I. He actually, very little in Francis about calling down the corruption of the hierarchy or any. I'm not saying that somebody else shouldn't do that, but it wasn't his vocation.
Mm-hmm.
His vocation wasn't to point fingers at everybody else. It was very much to take the words of Jesus to heart. Don't be pulling the log out of somebody else's eye, the splinter, when you get a log in your own. He spent his whole life trying to pull logs out of his eyes.
Yeah.
And he did it. And he attained great holiness, and he led to the renewal of the church. And that's the way it is in every era. So when you encounter corruption, difficulty, problems in the church, do you leave the church? Do you set up your own organization? Do you become your own pope? Or do you do what the saints do in every era, which is renew the faith in my own heart, in my family, in my community, go out there, try to live a holy life, and bring people to know Christ. The church is not the object of faith. The hierarchy is not the object of faith. Christ is the object of faith. And Christ is made present to us in the church through the ministrations of the holy and the unholy. And it's always been that way, and it always will be that way.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go.
I remember a number of times on this program you have said that when you came into the church, it was in the early 2000s. We were going through some rough waters at that time, and you pointed out that it was not because you were following a particular priest or a particular pope. You wanted to follow Jesus and the church that Jesus founded, and that's where we have to be.
Yeah. Your statement, who would want their child to become a priest? I know where you're coming from. I understand where you're coming from. And there have been eras in the church's history where the priesthood was highly regarded in society. A friend of mine who died in November was 101 years old and born in 1917 in Ireland. And he decided he wanted to become a priest when he was 7 years old. And he told me about half his class wanted to become priests because
Wow.
at that time, 1917, 1924, in Ireland, the priesthood was a highly regarded vocation, and it held a place in society and civil life that was highly regarded. And so people who had talent and abilities and competence, they didn't just say, well, I'll be a doctor or a lawyer or a politician. I'll be a priest. That's an honored thing to do. I value that. I'm glad that that was part of Irish culture. But guess what? There was something going on at the same time that because people valued the priesthood in that way, they were also blind sometimes to the priest's faults. And some of the corruption and abuse that's come to light in the last 20 years comes from an era in the church when, because there was a kind of blind trust in the sanctity or holiness of the priest, that people would either turn a blind eye or try to hide from public view things that were going on that shouldn't go on because, hey, we can't let anything tarnish this image of the holy priest. But that was just it. In some cases, it was just an image. Holiness doesn't work that way. Holiness is always taking the hard path. Who would want their child to become a priest today? Who would want their child to take up a very difficult vocation? To serve the universal church after the model of Christ, who had no friends, right? They all abandoned him.
Yeah.
Who died an ignominious death because he loved the people of God and wanted to bring them to salvation. Who would want that for their child? I think only somebody who had an incredibly strong faith in the supernatural character of the priesthood, that regardless of what society thinks, or the state of the hierarchy, or the difficulties that a person might encounter, or the temptations to which one might be exposed, a belief that even in such a time as that, God could work through a man and his vocation to bring people to holiness. That's the kind of person that would want their child to become a priest in this society.
You're listening to a special mailbag edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Here's a question now from Beth, and Beth says, in the Rosary, the fourth joyful mystery is the presentation of Jesus in the temple as an infant. Now, I can see how that could be joyful, but it's also recognizing the fact that Simeon said to Mary, a sword will pierce her heart. That seems counter to joyful. How can I say this decade without feeling sad about that prediction from Simeon about Mary?
Why would you want to say the decade without feeling sad? Feel sad all you like.
Sure.
Just because the decade has been categorized as one of the quote-unquote joyful mysteries, doesn't mean that the only way you can pray the rosary fruitfully is to try to put on an attitude of joy, on Mondays and Saturdays, and then all of a sudden you have to affect sorrow on Tuesdays and Fridays. It doesn't work that way. The images that we meditate on from the Gospels and the Rosary are meant to draw us into contemplation of mysteries from the life of Christ, and how the Holy Spirit speaks to you in your heart and uses that to affect in you the proper disposition. Well, that's going to be a very particular thing, depending on your state of life and where you're coming from.
Yes, indeed.
So if you get drawn into the sorrowful heart of Our Lady of Sorrows, well, good for you.
Go with it.
Go with it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Beth, thank you so much for your email. Here's one now from Joe. I have suffered with chronic anxiety, depression, and insomnia. I went to a healing mass by a local oblate priest who is known for healings. Without me saying anything, he told me I am suffering from a generational curse and will need special prayers and process to break the curse. So what is the official Catholic teaching on, quote, generational curse?
Thanks. Not aware that there is an official teaching on the idea of a generational curse. However, this priest sounds to me, is making a claim to private revelation. He is saying that he has some privileged insight into the unseen world that you don't have access to, that you wouldn't have access to through the normal means of, empirical or scientific investigation. And he's claiming to have a charism, a gift, that he can discern something in the supernatural order. That might be true, and that might not be true. That might be true, that might not be true. And you're not obligated to hold to this particular priest's interpretation of your problem. So you need to start with the normal means of grace in the church: faith, confession, practice of the virtues, frequent attendance at Mass, reception of Holy Communion, daily prayer, regime of daily prayer. I mean, these are the things that we know with the certainty that you're supposed to do. I think that it is not wrong also to seek the services of professionals who are competent and trained to help people deal with these conditions that are common, anxiety, depression, insomnia. I mean, even at the realm of, dealing with your overall general health. Look at your exercise regime. Look at your diet. Are you eating a lot of processed food? You're drinking too much? Are you smoking? These kinds of things can all play into that. How's your professional life? How's your marriage? I mean, a lot of things can come into play. You don't necessarily have to blame it all on some, spooky demonic thing that happened 3 generations ago. Let's look at the concrete circumstances of your life and places we might fix it. Now, it's also perfectly appropriate to pray for deliverance, to ask for others to pray for prayers of deliverance, to seek the intercession of your guardian angel, St. Michael the Archangel. I'm not saying you can't also address it at that level. But to default immediately to something that cannot be discerned through normal means, that relies on the judgment of a priest or the statement of a priest that he has some special privileged insight, I think you need to approach that with some degree of caution. Is it possible that people can be afflicted because of the sins of their parents or things in the ancestral line? Yes, of course that's possible. I mean, it's just bare human level. I mean, kids come into the world all the time and suffer from bad mistakes that their parents have made. The child who's born to drug-addicted parents, for example, no fault of the kid, but he's going to suffer the consequences of a parent's bad mistake. Anecdotally, when you talk to exorcists, you see sometimes people do get into trouble in the supernatural realm. Many times it's mistakes they've made, but sometimes it's mistakes that people in their family line have made, or they've asked for trouble and boy, they got it.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that's impossible. But seek the normal means of sanctity and the normal means of therapeutic healing first.
Sounds like good advice to me. Joe, thank you so much for your email. A quick question here from Jesse. Is God still present even in such an evil place as hell?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I appreciate the question a lot because it helps us understand what hell is and helps us understand who God is. So God is the very act of to be itself in everything that is, lives, moves, and has its being in God. So apart from God, there is literally nothing. If there's no God, then there's nothing. If God's not present to something, maintaining it in existence, then it literally cannot be. So God has to actively participate, has to be actively present by his immensity, by his power and his presence, for the damned souls and the fallen angels to continue to exist. If God stops humming, the music stops. So yes, he's present even there.
Sounds good.
And the psalmist says, if I descend to the depths, you are there.
Love that. And this is a special special mailbag edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. We're back in a moment here with lots more great emails that we've received over the past couple of weeks, so do stay with us. It's a special mailbag edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. By the way, if you'd like to send us an email for a future show, we've got a very nice mailbag. It's got stripes, it's plaid. Picture it however you want in your own theater of the mind. Actually, it's a folder, okay? It's just a folder. But mailbag sounds kind of cool. So if you'd like to send us an email for a future show, the address for the virtual mailbag is ctc@ewtn.com. ctc@ewtn.com. By the way, it's a very nice folder. Here's an email now from Anonymous. Why does the Catholic Church oppose contraception? And what is the Protestant position on contraception? You actually touched on that in your book, if I recall right.
Yes, I did. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So the Catholic Church opposes contraception because contraception makes the sexual act be something fundamentally, formally, categorically different. The act of sexual union within the context of the lifelong indissoluble union we call marriage, which is the intentional union, lifelong indissoluble union of a man and a woman for the sake of raising a family. That's part of the definition, which is by definition open to life. Sexual congress in that context has one meaning and a very different meaning when that openness to life and that commitment to the use of the sexual faculty for that purpose is removed. Now, this is very easy to see in extreme cases. So let's contrast the sexual congress of a husband and a wife from a prostitute and a client. Now, materially, mechanically, it could be the very same action. Right? Could be the very same action.
Yeah.
Formally, they are very different actions. What the client and the prostitute intend is very, very different from what the husband and wife intend. All right? I think that's evident. You can see that.
Sure.
Now, could a man have a wife whom he treated like a prostitute in the act of sexual congress? Yes. We think, what is it that the client seeks to accomplish in the sexual act with a prostitute? Is it possible, is it conceivable that a husband could intend that same thing in sexual congress with his wife? Yes, he could. He could exploit and objectify his wife merely for the purpose of his own sexual gratification. He could do that. Would that formally change the nature of the act? Yes, it would. Just like it formally changes the nature of the act within the sexual act of a prostitute and a client. It does. It changes the character of the act when the intention changes. What is the intent that ought to be brought to bear in sexual congress that makes it an intrinsically meritorious, worthwhile, beautiful thing? When a husband and wife come together for the purpose, that doesn't mean they have to intentionally intend conception in this act, but in general, their sexual congress is oriented towards the procreation of children. It's open in principle to the procreation of children. Mm-hmm. It's at the service of the procreation of children, and in that context also serves the end of unifying the husband and wife in a peculiar, specific kind of marital friendship, all right, which is the kind that's willing to lay down one's life for the sake of one's spouse, the kind that's willing to forego sexual relations for the sake of the purity of one's spouse. That's the nature and end of a meritorious, worthy sexual act. It's very, very different. As soon as you add the realm of artificial contraception or any kind of contraception, you fundamentally change the character of the act and the nature of the relationship, and you've devalued it and you've made it impure. So that's why. Because the Catholic Church says we want our purity of heart, without which no one will see God. We want to aim at purity of heart, that peculiar kind of self-giving friendship, of holiness of life that characterized the marriage of Christ and the Church. The willing self-sacrifice of one for the sake of the other to bring her or him to God. And the only way to come to God is through purity of heart, without which no one will see God. So what does your sexuality look like within marriage? Is it ordered towards the vision of God through purity? Or is it more similar to the sexual congress of the client and the prostitute?
Okay. And is there a Protestant, is there a unified Protestant viewpoint?
No unified Protestant viewpoint at all. However, I will generalize, and there are always exceptions when you talk about Protestants because they don't have a magisterium, they don't have one definitive answer. In general, Protestants don't think about moral questions in terms of the nature of acts or the intent of acts or what's the good of the human person or what are we made for. These are questions that emerge from consideration of natural law. Protestants don't tend to think of morality in that way. But in general, Protestant morality is grounded in what literal prescriptions can we find in the Bible? You know, show me chapter and verse where this says this is okay or this is not okay. or this is commanded, or this is allowed. And there's a tendency within Protestantism to say, well, if I can't find a command specifically forbidding it, it must be okay. And if God, commands it or forbids it, then it's okay or not okay. That's a divine command theory of ethics. And that's a very artificial way of thinking about ethics, because the Bible doesn't address all kinds of things. All kinds of questions are left undecided, but they don't cease thereby to have moral import or moral significance in the meaning of human action. So, my own experience as a Protestant becoming Catholic was I had this kind of prescriptive, legalistic view of morality, where I thought that God had basically drawn a box and said, don't do certain things outside the box. Inside the box, it's whatever you want to do. And it's very easy to have an exploitive, utilitarian view of sexuality within marriage as a Protestant. If you think, well, I know I can't go outside of marriage, but inside of marriage, God doesn't seem like he's written this specific prescription against contraception. So it's, it's whatever you want. And I've known a lot of men who have gone from Protestantism to Catholicism, and they've said, the biggest change in my life in becoming Catholic was I stopped treating my wife like a prostitute.
Wow. Well, there it is. Well, we do appreciate that, and this is a special mailbag edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. We followed that anonymous question with another anonymous question. We have a daughter who is very faithful to our faith. In her studies, she has been confronted with challenges to the validity of Vatican II. I believe that she cites the concluding comments of Lumen Gentium as creating a question of validity of the council. She claims that when she speaks with priests, etc., about the validity of the council, they don't seem to be able to answer her question with objective clarity as to the council being valid. She is really grappling with this. I'd love to be able to give her some conclusive evidence as to the validity of Vatican II. Could you please share some sources for her to give her some peace of mind? Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I really would like to get into the question of what it is in Lumen Gentium that's causing her trouble.
Yeah.
But all right, so what's necessary to have a valid council is that the Pope approves the meeting, right? It's recognized by the Church as an ecumenical council. Now, you can have a council that's valid. I mean, it really is a council called by the Universal Church to address questions of the Church's well-being without ever defining a single dogma. And that's what Vatican II was. Vatican II did not define a single dogma. All right? It explored ways of approach, ways of thinking about the Church and its pastoral task of the modern world. That doesn't mean that everything the Vatican II said was infallibly correct. I mean, it didn't define any dogmas. So it explored lines of approach, lines of reasoning, lines of pastoral engagement. And we have ongoing critical discussions about that. I mean, there were the Council of Nicaea, which did define dogma infallibly, the nature of Christ's divinity, also issued canons about matters of liturgical law. They can change.
Sure.
I mean, canons can change. So you don't get hung up on. I mean, I'm not sure what if your problem is like, okay, so Vatican II says something in paragraph 367 of some document. You're like, well, I don't see how that makes sense, or I can't coordinate that with something else I found. Okay, that's not a reason to reject the council. That's just, well, maybe they did a bad job with that document. All right, so they did a bad job with the document. So, what's your point?
Yeah. Okay. Hope that's helpful for you. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN. John sent us an email. He wants to know, what is the origin of canon law, and why does the Catholic Church put such man-made yokes of bondage on its faithful?
Oh, thanks. Appreciate that. Origin of canon law is in the Gospels and the Epistles of the New Testament. And let's say one of the first discussions of canonical principles in Catholic history comes from the words of Jesus when he said, if your brother is in sin, go to a fellow Christian or go to him. If he doesn't listen to you, bring another Christian. If he doesn't listen to that person, then you take it to the church. If he doesn't listen to the church, then you excommunicate him and treat him like a tax collector or a sinner. So here Christ established something like criminal procedure, if you will, what's the procedure to follow in the case of individual sin, and then the imposition of canonical penalty. So that's in the words of Jesus right there. So that's canon law. St. Paul does the same thing. If you read 1 Corinthians, it's canon law all over 1 Corinthians. Paul says, okay, here's the procedure to follow when celebrating the Eucharist. Here's the procedure to follow when dealing with a case of personal immorality. Here's the procedure to follow when dealing with an issue of invalidity of marriage. All these kinds of things, questions that would arise in the concrete circumstances of living out the Christian faith. This is canon law. The Gospel, Book of Acts, chapter 15, canonical principles about, okay, what do you do in a community that is a Christian community where there are Jews who still practice Hebraic law, worshiping together with Gentiles who don't have to follow Mosaic law. What are the best principles to bring into bear practically to help them live together within the same community? How do we define that? All right, that's canonical principle, right? And it's universally binding around the church. The Gospels and Epistles are full of this. They're full of it. So canon law is grounded in the teaching of Christ and the apostles. It's trying to come up with legal principles, principles of organization that have the force of law to govern a complex group of people trying to live something brand new. The church was a brand new institution in the world. Nothing quite like it ever before in human history, that you would have people from every race, language, tongue, and nation, male, female, slave free, high and low, gathered together across cities and lands into an intentional community, participating in a common enterprise, professing one faith with a common mission. Well, how are you going to coordinate that without ordinances derived from reason in the service of the common good, i.e. law? Can law change? Of course it can change. As concrete circumstances change, laws change. But you cannot have an ordered community of faith without principles governing it. Now, any attempt to get rid of canon law will fail. What you will have instead is an unwritten law. You'll have arbitrary shifting law. If you've ever been in a congregational church, or maybe a Baptist church that says, "Hey, we've got no law but the Bible," or something like that. They got law all over the place. It's just unwritten. I long time ago, before I was a Catholic, I got invited to serve as a deacon in a Baptist church. It was interesting. It was actually a Korean Baptist church, and I was the one non-Korean in the diaconate. And Baptist churches are supposed to be congregational, but Korean culture tends to be very hierarchical, and so I found that the pastor exercised an inordinate amount of authority relative to what he would have exercised in an Anglo church, right? Even though with the same polity, even the same Baptist polity. And they had I had a situation when I was there where there was a couple in the church that had gotten involved in a charismatic movement that was very prominent in the Korean community at the time. And they were advocating a spirituality that was different from what was dominant in that particular Baptist church, and it was causing quite a lot of conflict in that particular congregation. And they needed to know how to deal with it, so they brought it to their diaconate. Now, what's a diaconate in the Baptist church? Well, it's a form of government embedded in what their sort of procedural constitution, but they didn't have any law written down to try to deal with this kind of conflict. And as a result, they were making sort of ad hoc decisions on the fly, and a lot of people got their feelings hurt because they didn't have a written principle to try to guide how do you adjudicate disputes in this particular instance. So it would have been better if they'd had a written principle, and everybody could have said, hey, when people have fights over this kind of thing, here's how you handle it. Instead, tempers flew and people split, and it was ugly.
Wow.
So you can't really get away from the need of this, even in the tiny little community like a itty-bitty little Baptist church.
John, thank you so much for your email. We're doing a special mailbag edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Here's one now from Nick, and a lot of people ask this question. What happens to the souls of everyone who died before Christ?
Well, they go to heaven, hell, or purgatory.
Okay.
That's where they go.
Okay.
Well, actually, I take that back. I'm going to stop there. They'll eventually end up in heaven, hell, or purgatory.
Okay.
All right. before the ascension, they would have gone to the righteous dead who died in the friendship of God in the state of grace would have gone to the limbus of the fathers, the bosom of Abraham, all right, a place of natural happiness, but not the beatific vision, as they await Christ to ascend into heaven, be the first to open the gates of heaven. But, I mean, their vocation, their destiny, like every human soul ever created, is ultimately towards either, heaven or hell.
Okay. Appreciate that. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Interesting one here now from Terry. The Apostle Matthew was married, and yet the church refuses to allow its priests to marry? I understand the church may be concerned about a potential conflict, but does it appear as though the church is enforcing a law or rule that is in direct conflict with Jesus' intention to allow priests to marry? Thanks, Terry.
Thanks. So, no place in Jesus' teaching or in any of the canonical scriptures is there any provision made to allow priests to marry. Never. There are married priests.
Yes.
That's very different from allowing priests to marry. Having a married priest is very different from allowing a priest to marry. What do I mean by that distinction? So 1 Timothy 3, verse 2, St. Paul says the priest must be, or the bishop must be, the husband of but one wife. That has always been the Catholic principle. So let's say you have a married priest, and we've got them today. We have married priests in the Catholic Church, and his wife dies. It's one and done, buddy.
That's it.
That's it. The husband of but one wife. After that, you don't get a second one. Same thing goes for deacons. All right? And so if you are ordained a priest and you are married, you may not marry again. If you are ordained a priest and you're not married, you may not become married. A married man can be ordained to the priesthood. A priest cannot become a married man. You see.
Mm-hmm.
And that remains the practice within the Catholic Church today. Now, the Catholic Church consists in multiple liturgical traditions, liturgical rites, communities across the world. The Roman Rite, the Latin Rite of the Church, is the biggest. It's the most prominent. And the discipline within the Latin Rite is that the Catholic Church, generally speaking, only ordains unmarried men. There are other rites of the Catholic Church where married men are admitted to the sacred priesthood. And there are a few exceptions within the Latin Rite of married men who are admitted to the priesthood. But the preference is for unmarried men. Why? Well, first of all, we have the example of Christ. Christ is the great high priest. He is the model of all Christian priesthood, and he was, of course, the great celibate who lived a perfectly chaste life. And so a priest, when he models himself after the life of Christ, perfect form of that life is going to be following him in everything that he did, including his chastity and celibacy, his continence. St. Paul, who was also unmarried, acknowledges the possibility of a married priest, but says, better not to. Better not to. Better to live like me, so you can give yourself entirely to the work of the church.
Mm-hmm.
So the Latin Rite of the Church has always said, we think we're going to follow what St. Paul says here. It's better not to marry if you're going to be serving the church. So that's our preference, and the law is going to reflect that with the possibility of exceptions. And that's what we do.
Okay.
Very biblical principle.
Yes, indeed. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Brian in Tempe, Arizona says, how do you respond to the argument of, quote, equal protection under the law for legalizing gay marriage? I am opposed to it, of course, but a lot of people justify it for that reason.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. So what do we mean by the term marriage? And this is a very, very fundamental question. Here's one way to look at it. Why is there such an institution called marriage when you look across human cultures and down through history? And you don't have to be Catholic to see this. You don't have to be Christian to see this. You can talk about Buddhist marriage or Hindu marriage or Islamic marriage or Jewish marriage or the marriage of two atheists. Doesn't matter. The reason through human history that there is such an institution is for the blindingly obvious reason that when men and women get together in intimate union, babies tend to happen. If there's one thing that is quote-unquote traditional in marriage down through the century, it's not just the male-female aspect of marriage or the procreative aspect. It's that marriage is almost until the 19th century never about romance and passion and sexual inclination. And it's always about things like inheritance rights and legitimacy and kinship bonds that are formed through replenishing society through the act of procreation. That's what marriage has traditionally served in all cultures everywhere. And there are even to this day many cultures where the whole question of passion, romance, sexual inclination doesn't even play in. That's why you can have something like an arranged marriage and we still have cultures like in India, they still practice arranged marriages many times. Love and passion may come into it at some point down the line, but that's not what's driving the decision. I was like, who's a good spouse for my child, and how is this going to benefit the family, and all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
These are the kind of considerations that go into the thing. What happens historically is in the West, and pretty much uniquely in the West, in the 19th century, early 20th century, the romantic ideal of man and woman in sexual union comes into play and becomes a real dominant part of the conception of what makes for a good marriage. Oh, well, you have to find your soulmate. You have to find somebody you're sexually attracted to, yada, yada, yada. Well, as soon as that ideology comes in, that's when you begin to see the demand for no-fault divorce. Because guess what? You're never going to marry the Hollywood superstar, and if you do, she's not going to stay the Hollywood superstar for very long, right? I mean, that's ephemeral, that's passing. Mm-hmm. But when that idea becomes the dominant one, and then you get the contraceptive culture of the 1960s and 70s, and it becomes possible to separate separate sexuality, passion, inclination from the procreative act, then our culture does this radical shift and says, oh, well, marriage is just about sexual inclination, passion, and so forth. And they redefine the meaning of the word away from what is that social institution that protects the institution of parenthood and child rearing and lines of inheritance and legitimacy and so forth. And now it becomes, what is that social institution that validates my sexual inclination? Well, we're talking about two fundamentally different things. Why would society have an interest? Why should society have an interest in creating a brand new institution for the purpose of granting legitimacy to my fetish?
Yeah.
And that's what this new definition of marriage does. It says, as a culture, this is what Justice Kennedy basically argued in Obergefell versus Hodges, the gay marriage case. Justice Kennedy basically argued it is in the best interest of society for us to validate and legitimize sexual fetish. Why on God's green earth do we need that?
I know.
We don't. That's an absurd hypothesis. But you can make a very strong case that society should protect parenthood, the obligation of mothers and fathers to the kids they bring into the world, and the rights of children to have their biological mother and father care for them. That you can make a very strong case for.
Yes. We're going to close now with this question from Don in Metairie, Louisiana. Where in the Old Testament do we see Moses write about Jesus? Do you know of such a spot?
Thank you. I appreciate it. So Christ and intimations of Christ are all through the Old Testament. And we could do a whole show just on Messianic prophecies of the Old Testament. The very first one comes in the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis, Genesis 3:15, where God prophesies that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. This is sometimes called the Proto-Evangelion, or the Proto-Gospel. First proclamation. Towards the end of the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 12, God tells Abraham that through his seed all generations will be blessed, a promise that is fulfilled in Jesus. Towards the end, and I'm trying to think of the chapter, Moses prophesies about Judah, that from Judah will come forth a scepter that will rule the nations, and that's a Messianic prophecy. Then you get a deepening of the Messianic prophecy in 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God promises that this seed will come not just through Judah, but through David's line, that David will never cease to have a son ruling Israel. Well, there's no king in Israel right now. I mean, physically, so we know that has to have some sort of spiritual fulfillment. This is a kingdom that I can't see with the visible eye. And we'll skip all the way to Daniel chapter 2, where God prophesies that in the last days this kingdom will emerge that will crush every other kingdom before it, and it'll never be done away with. That's the Messianic kingdom. Now, I could fill in the blanks if I had more time.
See you next time.